Reilly. He will see his name in the latest edition of StubbsGazette, the debt monitoring magazine, which will be on the shelves in the next few days. Dr. Reilly will be listed in Stubbs with 3 business partners for having failed to comply with a High Court order to pay almost €2 million to purchase a nursing home in County Tipperary. The appearance of his name in Stubbs could make it difficult for Dr. Reilly to access credit in the future and possibly have implications for his political future. Joining me on the line now, James Treacy, MD of StubbsGazette, and Fionnan, Sheehan, political editor of the Irish Independent. Good morning to you both.
Good morning, Pat.
Fionnan, perhaps you'd talk us through Dr. Reilly's investment in the nursing home and how he got himself into this pickle.
Sure. Back in the year 2000, 13 people came together to invest in the scheme. It was quite typical at the time that there were tax reliefs largely laid on by the then Finance Minister Charlie McCreevy to encourage people to invest in capital developments like this. The net effect of the deal was that 8 of them would get out after 10 years and be bought out by the other 5. Dr. Reilly was one of the 5 who was going to stay on to remain as the owner of the property. Obviously that time ran out after the decade, and then a dispute emerged over the agreed price and the contract that had been signed.
All right, just to clarify what these guys were doing. They invest and they put their money in, they borrow money from the bank, and they buy this asset. They benefit from the tax breaks for 10 years.
Yeah.
And when the tax breaks have run out, then certain people who possibly don't have an interest long term in the nursing home business get out, and those who do stay in. Buy out their partners.
Yeah, to the deal. So Dr. Reilly was one of the 5 who was staying on and was going to buy out his partners. The dispute appears to centre on the value of the nursing home. Obviously, what it was projected to be worth 12 years ago was quite different to what it would be regarded as being worth now. This ended up before the High Court in February. A settlement was reached, and the High Court agreed to that, and the High Court ordered Dr. Reilly and the 4 other individuals to pay over $1.9 million to purchase the Greenhouse Nursing Home in Carrick-on-Suir in County Tipperary. It was put on stay of execution until the end of April, so it was obviously expected that the matter would be tidied up by then. It doesn't appear to have been. A judgment was listed 10 days ago against the 5 individuals for not paying this debt, and hence the 5 names, including the first ever time that a sitting cabinet minister has appeared, have now ended up in StubbsGazette.
All right, we'll come back to you in a second, Fionnan. Now, James Treacy, the MD of Stubbs, explain what the purpose of Stubbs is and why someone ends up in the columns in Stubbs.
StubbsGazette, Pat, would be a register of all judgments that have been registered in the 4 courts. As Fionnan mentioned, this was before the commercial court back in February. An agreement was made, a summary judgment was granted against the 5 individual investors, and for whatever reason it wasn't settled, so the plaintiffs in this case took a registered judgment against them. So this would have an adverse effect on the individual's credit rating. Back in the good old days, in the boom time, the banks they pretty much took their eye off the ball and didn't really evaluate people's credit ratings as much as they should have done. But now that there's a credit crunch on and money is very scarce, the banks have actually done a 360-degree full turn, and they will be almost looking for reasons to refuse people credit. So to have a registered judgment against your name would be a very detrimental would have a very detrimental impact.
A couple of things. When I was growing up, Stubbs was a shorthand for bankrupt. That if your name was in Stubbs, it meant you were in Queer Street, it meant that you'd no money and that you were all washed up. That's not absolutely the case, is it?
No, there are various different forms of personal insolvency. Now, having a judgment registered against you doesn't mean that you're personally insolvent. The further extreme would be if you were declared bankrupt, but there are actually very few people in Ireland. I think last year there were only probably about 50 people declared bankrupt, because it is quite an arduous process. Now, that's all due to be changed now under the new personal insolvency legislation.
The question of the banks themselves, I mean, the banks clearly couldn't pay their debts and we had to bail them out. Did they appear in Stubbs?
To my knowledge, banks haven't had judgments registered against them. They would be the ones that are pursuing individuals and companies.
No, I'm just wondering, because they couldn't pay their debts. I mean, they had to get the taxpayer to give them money to pay back their bondholders, and that to me is, a person who's in a similar position, if you like, to Dr. Reilly and his cohorts. But they don't appear in Stubbs, because there would be, if you like, an equality of esteem if the banks appeared in Stubbs and other people appeared in Stubbs. You could actually, talk about the joint experience.
A very good point. I suppose it's up to whoever's providing the funds to the Irish banks at the moment, which would probably be the Troika. So it'd probably be up to the Troika then to take a judgment against the banks if they renege on their repayment schedule.
So the implications for any individual appearing in Stubbs is that when they go to these banks who've behaved so badly themselves and continue to so do, I'm thinking of Ulster Bank's technical glitches, that the banks will use Stubbs as a club to beat them over the head with, irrespective of the bad behaviour of the banks.
I guess so, and as I mentioned, because of the scarcity of credit at the moment, banks and other credit providers are really looking at an individual's ability and to pay, and they're looking at their credit rating, and having a registered judgment, particularly for such a large amount, will have an extremely detrimental effect on your ability to get credit.
However, it's well known that Dr. Reilly has lots of assets. So there may be other factors. I mean, there are a number of individuals involved. I presume all the individuals in this judgment will be named in Stubbs alongside Dr. Reilly?
Yep, there were 4 mentioned in this particular case. It's an unusual, it's an exotic judgment in some respects, because the total amount of the debt is just under 2 million, and the way the contract was drawn up, I gather, is that they're all joint and severally liable.
So if one of the people can't pay, the others have to pony up on their behalf.
Exactly, and if 3 of them can't pay, one of them is left carrying the can for the full amount. So, in general terms, the creditor will generally go after a good mark. So, for example, if they know a certain individual of a partnership has a lot of assets, that's who they will target. Or if a certain individual has a reputation that they don't necessarily want to be published in the media or to be on the Pat Kenny show, that's who they will go after.
Their moral landscape is a very interesting one, isn't it? Anyway,
yeah, it's an unusual joint and several liability. So it's buyer beware. So when you're looking at these contracts, obviously when they signed the contracts originally, they didn't think that it would go pear-shaped.
This is the worst form of publicity that a politician can potentially expect to receive, isn't it?
It is. I suppose Fionnan would be a better place to comment on that.
Well, we'll ask Fionnan on that. I mean, the fact that this is so forensically analysed maybe makes it slightly less embarrassing for Dr. Reilly?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's worse things that a politician could be hauled up on. I mean, there's nothing criminal involved here. In this case, his difficulty is that Dr. Reilly is already under pressure on a political level, both at government and opposition level, as a result of his failure to manage budgets within the health envelope. The HSE has chalked up a deficit of 280 million. That could hit 500 million by the end of the year. if something is not done about it. He's held special meetings in the past week with the Taoiseach, the Finance Minister Michael Noonan, and Public Spending Minister Brendan Howland. There's due to be further meetings this week with a view to resolving what's going to happen there. There's a special debate down in the Dáil on Tuesday and Wednesday night, specifically on the health budget, where the opposition parties will be trying to tease out the government in terms of what exactly is going to happen here. Is it going to result, is this failure to manage the budget going to result in further health service cutbacks? So he's under the cosh already. He's currently out of the country. He's in Cyprus at an EU finance ministers meeting. His spokesman managed to manfully track him down last night, even though he was flying late to Cyprus. Dr. Reilly's core point is that he transferred this asset into a trust operated by his solicitor when he became minister, so that in effect he couldn't be accused of having any conflict of interest as a result of being the Minister for Health and being part owner of a property that housed a nursing home. He also says, there's no question of disputing the amount that has to be paid here. Is just a matter of working it out. And he also makes the point that once that is sorted out, he's going to look to divest himself to effectively pass on his share once this matter is sorted out and move himself away from it entirely. But it doesn't look good at all that you have, first of all, a cabinet minister listed in StubbsGazette as a debt defaulter, and then secondly that this same cabinet minister is already under pressure on another financial front, namely in his own department.
And James, the question of a judgment being made against someone, and then if it's not paid within a particular denominated period, that you end up in StubbsGazette, even if there are ongoing negotiations, does that still happen? If the deadline passes, that it automatically goes in, or does someone have to make a decision, I want to put this person in Stubbs?
Well, exactly. Yeah. No, there are a number of enforcement options available even after registration. If the creditor figures out that some of the debtors have assets, they could appoint a sheriff to go and repossess those assets and sell them to part pay some of the liability. And the extreme enforcement would be to pursue somebody for bankruptcy. But that very rarely happens in Ireland because it's very onerous.
No, I'm just wondering whether or not, if there is some sort of negotiation still underway, does that forestall the process of going into Stubbs, or is it just an automatic thing that once deadlines?
There would be negotiations before registration. Like registration would be one of the pieces of the end game. So there would have been negotiations beforehand. Now, because it is a bit of an exotic judgment because of the joint and several liability, it makes it a bit complicated. So, for example, if there's 5 partners and only one of them has the wherewithal to pay, well, they would have to pay the full amount. And then they would have to make a decision then after paying the full amount, do they pursue the other investors so that would be an option open to them.
A couple of things coming in. Mobile phone companies register judgments all over the place. A complete joke to use this for such purposes. Is that true? Do you have mobile phone companies using Stubbs?
Yeah, some judgments are for very small amounts. Some judgments could be less than €100. But the very fact that it has gone through the court process and it's been published in Stubbs and it's listed on our credit bureau, it does have a detrimental effect on your credit rating because it has gone through the courts and it is an official judgment. So just by virtue of the fact that there's a small amount, I would advise debtors, if at all possible, to engage with the mobile phone companies, to engage with your credit union, to engage with your utility company, no matter how small it is, and they will generally enter into some kind of repayment scheme, whether it's over 6 months or whether it's over 6 years. But to be listed especially in today's environment, to have a negative mark against your credit rating is not good.
Yeah. The question here: when are the banks going to pay back the Irish taxpayer? What are their repayment terms and the interest rates that we are charging them? They are making money again, but are they paying back their debts? Well, I don't think they've enough money to start repaying the billions. We are, of course, owners of the banks, and in theory, if there ever was to be a dividend from an Irish bank, we would get a proportionate amount, and then we could flog it off to a willing buyer if we could find one, and hopefully recoup some of the money. That's the theory. Fionnan, the point one of my callers here is making, Tommy, and this is the point you were making: if he can't manage his own finances, he has no hope of managing the health budget. Isn't that the dilemma?
Yeah, Dr. Reilly came into the Department of Health, on the back of a quite successful period as opposition health spokesperson, but that certainly hasn't worked out, and his reputation has certainly not been enhanced by his opening 18 months in that department. A lot of bluster from his end, but very little delivered. You'd have to say that the patience, certainly on the Labour Party end of the government with him, has worn quite thin. Of all of the Fine Gael ministers, he seems to be the one that grates most with him. There was his difficulty is that he came in on a reforming agenda, and it's very difficult to implement such reforms when you're having to cut back on spending so dramatically. So he's neither the reform nor the reduction in spending is happening adequately. On a personal level, the joint and several liability is interesting from his end. Setting aside the other four individuals here for a moment, we know that Dr. Reilly is a man of considerable means. He owns a stately home in County Offaly. It's in his wife's name. It's just outside Barack Obama's home village of Moneygall. He owns a town centre in Lusk where his quite successful GP's practice is based. He's no longer obviously operates there because he's as long as he's Minister for Health, and he owns a number of other different pieces of land, sites and agricultural land in 3 or 4 different counties around the country. So there would appear to be a substantial amount of money that he has, certainly to back up any liabilities that he has here.
All right, well, famously, it was known, the Department of Health, as Angola. The HSE, you could probably call it Syria or Sierra Leone or Somalia these days. Still a difficult place for a minister to thrive. But for the moment anyway, Fionnan, Sheehan, political editor of the Irish Independent, and James Treacy, MD of StubbsGazette. Thanks a million for joining us on the phone. Now later, we'll be talking to Duncan Stewart.